last speaker this morning is going to kind of downtown, in a way. No. Tom Osdoba is with the Portland Sustainability Institute, I believe, on the board or working there, but he's what described as social entrepreneur and strategic advisor, having launched numerous innovative new enterprises. For the past few years, until recently, he was managing director for the University of Oregon Center for Sustainable Business, which seeks to educate future sustainable business leaders focused on the leading edge of innovation in business and sustainability. And I think we've gotten a really good flavor for who the entrepreneurs are that are going to take us to 2050 and beyond, just a flavor of that. And so what Tom's going to talk about today is a new era of urban innovation.
Thank you, Nora. Good morning, everyone. Gosh, we were laughing beforehand at how long it's been since I was at a BioCycle conference, and so I approach you sort of humbly, having not been involved in the recycling and waste reduction field intensively for many years, although I did spend about a decade of my life in Minnesota doing that. I don't know if there's anyone here from Minnesota, but if you thought you got rid of me, here I am, back again. I'm going to talk about infrastructure and investment, and it's pretty intensively focused on sort of urban or city sort of infrastructure related to not just waste, but all kind of ecosystem services: energy, water, waste, mobility, shelter, that kind of thing. And we don't have a ton of time, so I'm just going to talk for a few minutes, and I have a number of slides I'll go through, and I made more slides intentionally than I could go through because those of you who want to get access to these, you may find them useful if this information is helpful. So, and I just have to say this is a little bit of a shift of gears after hearing Chad, and it was fascinating as a kid who grew up on a farm to sort of hear this sort of information. I'm not quite sure I can even carry on at this point. It's so sobering to see all of that. But what I want to talk about relates a little bit more to the challenge that cities are going to face. And you can't pick up a periodical anymore for 6 straight months without there being a cover story about cities. Whether it's Forbes or Business Week or The Economist or even more traditional forms of media that focus more on public sector issues in cities. And the reason for that has been well documented in terms of the migration of people into cities and the challenges of meeting those needs in a way that is even remotely pretending to be sustainable over the long term. And in that context, it's not really overstating it to say that this generation that we're starting will in part be defined by how well we reinvent the delivery of key services in our cities. And these urban ecosystem services are critical to survival, literally, and they're also critical to civilized, stable communities. Global demand is putting huge pressure on our capacity to deliver these services in our current models. And if I accomplish anything in the 15 minutes we have here, I want to put in your mind the notion that while we can quickly identify what it is we need to do, we need to decarbonize our energy system, we need to figure out how to reuse and recycle water, we need to learn how to feed ourselves without killing ourselves, we need to manage our own waste, et cetera, et cetera. How we do that is something that's going to change rapidly, hopefully, in the next decade and in our lifetimes. And I just want to offer a few comments on that, because in so many ways, our current business model for delivering many ecosystem services can be captured by this not very funny cartoon. For those of you who read The New Yorker, you always kind of wonder if they're trying to be funny or not. And of course, the Greeks remind us that all comedy is tragedy. But what are the key elements into thinking about our business models around these key aspects? And I would say one of the things that we don't do very well, we've mapped resource and material flows We understand how those things move about, but we almost never, and we map assets, we almost never map cash flow. And if we don't map cash flow, we don't know how to build a business model that can do something better. And so one of our great challenges is to map cash flows. And just to give you a little flavor for that, in Portland and Multnomah County, we spend about $1.5 billion a year on energy. Does anybody know how that money's spent and where it goes? Can they visualize the flow of that cash? If we're going to capture opportunities to invest in efficiency and cleaner forms of energy and upgraded infrastructure, we need to capture that cash, because that's going to pay for the investments in the systems we need. But we haven't actually mapped that cash flow out to really know where it goes. It goes to the utility, and then where does it go? Well, we don't know. Unless it's maybe a municipal utility, then we have some idea from an energy perspective. In the Portland metro region, we spend about $4.5 billion per year on food. Same thing. We know sort of vaguely that a very small percentage of that food is produced within the region. But beyond that, you couldn't really show anybody in one place where that money goes. Who gets it? What do they do with it? How does it relate to these challenges that both David and Chad have talked about that we're trying to solve? So let's just add, how about mobility, transportation? How do we spend our dollars? Where does it go? What does it go for? We're trying to electrify urban transportation systems, but we have no idea where the money's going that we're spending now to think about how to capture that revenue to invest in electrification of the system. Well, I can tell you what's not going to solve the problem in transportation and trying to electrify transportation, which is simply following the path we've followed with energy efficiency and hybrids, which is the early adopter marketplace creates a certain segment of market penetration. And the reason is because at some point you've got to flip to 100% market penetration to make electrification rational. That's not going to be driven in a consumer-driven model. Just not going to work that way. But yet that's all we ever talk about. Let's throw some more incentives at consumers. I would say energy efficiency is the same problem. We continue to throw incentives at people when we're asking them to do more stuff. And if our goal was to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 10 to 20 to 30%, I would say that's a reasonable strategy and has a good chance of success. But the problem is that's not our goal in greenhouse gas emission reductions, is it? So how we do that is very important, and we have to count all the costs. It's well documented, although we sort of gloss over the fact that there are multiple externalities. And I, as an economist, just trying to think about putting dollars on the externalities that Chad's talked about. That's about 10 careers worth of work right there. And it needs to be done in the next decade, as far as I can tell. But if we don't acknowledge them and account for them strategically, even if we're not required to transactionalize and monetize those costs, we should at least be accounting for them in our income statements and in our balance sheets, because it'll fundamentally lead to a different understanding of what a business model could look like and how we might mobilize capital. And I'll give you a couple of examples about how to deal with that. How many folks here in your own home or vehicle or air travel offset your greenhouse gas emissions? Very few people. It's a whole separate topic as to why you're not doing that. And I certainly don't want everyone to feel guilty about not offsetting, because I think offsetting in today's volunteer, uncoordinated market doesn't accomplish very much. But what if we said we're going to solve our community scale energy problem by having everybody in the community do the equivalent of a voluntary offset so that we can organize capital to invest in energy efficiency and clean energy in our own community? Well, what would that look like? Well, if you just took the single family houses in the city of Portland alone and did just a $10 a ton voluntary offset on all of those homes, do you know how much money you would produce on an annual basis? $20 million of revenue. And at a household level, it's about 25 cents a day. But $20 million of revenue, for those of you who do infrastructure finance, allows you to leverage quite a bit of capital for making investment. In fact, it would allow you to leverage in a traditional municipal bond structure about $200 million of capital. So all of a sudden you'd have $200 million to begin investing in energy efficiency and clean energy in your own community. That's without considering opportunities to leverage private equity investment that would be interested in participating as well. Well, if you marry that with what it would actually take to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from those 200,000 single-family homes by 80% over the next 20 years, you'd realize that you need to do 10,000 buildings a year for 20 years. And when you add up the amount of investment that you would put in for energy efficiency, solar where it made sense, and upgrades to infrastructure, you'd be talking about $100 to $150 million a year. Well, you have $200 million. You need, over the course of 20 years, $2.5 billion. Where's that money going to come from? Well, one place it might come from would be private equity institutional investors who were interested in fairly modest return activity that happens at a large scale. And one example that we've actually had conversations with is an Australian pension fund that would be very interested in investing a minimum of $100 million a year into retrofitting an entire community over a 20-year period of time. They don't want to talk about less than $2 to $3 billion worth of investment. They won't come to you for less than $100 million worth of investment activity. But if you had $200 million of your own money and a plan to organize around that, you might have a chance of moving that forward. That's just on the energy side. Let's talk about food a little bit. I mentioned we spend about $4.5 billion per year on food in the region. To add to the sort of specter of doom that Chad laid out in our food system, one of the other grave threats, literally grave threats to our continued existence on this planet, is the failure of pollination. Because bee colonies are collapsing across the planet, and we don't even know why, much less what are we going to do about it. One of the things we do know is that the lack of appropriate habitat and careful attention to biodiversity is certainly contributing to this problem. You could talk about the industrial model of bees and what's wrong with that, but that's fairly obvious. Well, what if we said we're going to internalize the cost of pollination services in our food transactions? And let's just say, for a thought experiment, 1%. Is pollination, is continued food worth 1%? On a transactional basis, I think most of us will probably get over it fairly quickly. We have a hard time having a policy conversation about it. But at our own scale, that's a fairly modest ask, given what's at stake. Well, all of a sudden, you'd have $40 million of revenue in the Portland metro region to invest in pollination services at a regional scale. That's just that revenue. That's not figuring out how to leverage it through capital financing schemes. It's not looking at how to leverage other private capital associated with that from private business or private landowners. That's just pure revenue that you can begin to think about, how do we solve this problem at a regional scale? Particularly when we're going to have to, whether we like it or not, learn how to produce more of our food closer to home. At the same time, we're solving some of the problems that Chad's been identifying in our agricultural sector. Once you start thinking about food that way, I would argue that once you start working your way through that, you've solved the residential food waste problem. Because you need that material so badly to stay where the food's being produced that it's no longer a cost. It's a revenue stream at a community scale. And if you've captured food waste at a neighborhood scale because it's used in food production and pollination, tied to pollination services and so forth, if you did that in the Portland metro region, just at single-family household scale, and it allowed you to move from weekly garbage collection to monthly because you have nothing rotting in the bin, and you split the cost difference under today's price structure at the City of Portland between weekly and monthly, and you aggregated it, you got $30 million of revenue. That's a lot of money. Start working on enterprises that are trying to solve these problems at a community scale. These are business model challenges and opportunities that we have to tackle this. Shifting gears a little bit, I want to talk a little bit about scale and how to get to tackling these problems at the right scale. And I'm going to move through some slides here to wrap up and make this point. But one of the things we've been doing here in Portland, and it's now spreading everywhere, is talking about sort of neighborhood or district scale approaches to solving these problems. And there's a really important reason for that. It's because if we try to do this as consumers, we're never going to get the job done. We're going to make incremental progress. But if you're doing backcasting, as David said, incremental progress isn't solving the problem. It's making the problem less bad. If we're going to solve the problem, we have to backcast, which means you have to solve it at a systems level, which requires you to take a neighborhood approach or a district scale approach. And over the past decade, our views of scale have evolved from buildings to distributed renewable energy to stormwater management. I think now we're moving into a point in which urban ag and food waste is going to be considered in that respect. And trying to aggressively drive new models of delivering the services that those systems provide at a neighborhood scale. One of the things that we need to do that well is to have more thought experiments, much more radical thought experiments, such as some of the ones I've talked about around energy, around water, around urban food systems or electric vehicles, short-term energy storage, as another example. And we need to invest in more skunk works that have the freedom to innovate and take chances that our cities or other institutions don't have license to do. It's very difficult to innovate in the current environment because we have the ability to execute and deliver services today. This is just another map to make us feel more depressed this morning. What the world could look like at the end of this century, given current projections for climate temperature increases. You can see there's going to be a need for a little bit of investment in infrastructure and, frankly, moving entire cities. I used to joke about 6 years ago about someday somebody's going to have the job to tell Phoenix they have to move. And it's quite interesting to hear how many people are saying that now. Because we're realizing that the level of magnitude of investment that we need to make is quite profound. You can get this at thenewscientist.org, I think. And it's roughly equivalent to, I think, the news that came out in the last few weeks about the model projections for temperature increase that have been updated by the UN in looking at current projections, which is far more serious and far faster than we would have projected. Lake Mead could be dry by 2020. It's literally a coin flip at this point. 50-50 probability. Not that it will be degraded by X%, but that quite literally it would be dry. So, Phoenix, here's your challenge. At the same time, we have these sort of goals coming into play. Companies like Walmart, the largest corporation in the world, in the history of the world, making a commitment to 100% renewable energy, zero waste, and selling sustainable products. They're nowhere near that. But just having those goals changes the conversation that they have every day, and they've made remarkable progress over the last few years. How are we doing? Great. Great. More locally, about 3 years ago, one of our developers here made a commitment that the buildings they develop will be net producers of power within 5 years. That was 3 years ago, so we're just about there. Very lofty. Well, what if we threw our own audacious goals out there and said, what if every neighborhood needed no outside energy for heating and cooling, produced a significant share of its electricity and fresh water, managed all of its organic waste and sewage, produced significant amounts of fresh foods, and was home to a diversity of wild species that thrive in urban habitat, such as pollinators? That's a fairly tall order, but I think Chad already stole my Einstein reference, but there are others who said the same thing. You're not going to solve today's problems by using the same thinking or having the same people work on the solutions who actually created the problem. You have to change who's involved, and you have to change the kind of thinking that's at stake. Further, the greatest challenges that we face are not technological or economic, they're institutional. There's a myth that if we're concerned about an issue and we have knowledge of best practice that will allow us to get there, that we'll take action, which is actually not true. We don't take action unless we actually invest in institutional capacity to then follow through with that action. So how do we bridge that gap? Thinking about these business models is not about saying where we are, how do we move incrementally forward. You never span that bridge by adding another piece of wood at one end. You have to think about something completely different to get it done. And that requires a framework that I think has three parts. One is innovation, and invest aggressively in innovation at a community level. Research and development. There's a lot of research and development that's being done right now. It needs to be put into place and tested. And the idea there is that we need to turn our cities literally into sandboxes to test these new ideas and rapidly move towards commercialization. Moving very slowly and very cautiously isn't the answer. It also means as a city, you fundamentally change your perspective. Instead of adapting new policies based on satisfying the most recalcitrant neighborhood in the city, who will finally go along with something, you seek out and select the early adopter neighborhoods and you work with them and you invest in innovation and you support their efforts. And then third is to export and exchange those ideas. By the businesses that are part of that are going to be valuable businesses everywhere else as well, and connect to others who are doing the same thing. And just to wrap up, I want to give you a little sense of how these business models can come about. And it means thinking differently about who it is we're trying to serve here. This is a curve that anybody who's looked at energy and climate issues recognizes. It's put together by McKinsey and Company, looking at a 2030 80% greenhouse gas abatement. Across the horizontal, you can see the impact in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and then the vertical is the net cost of each of these various measures. And what they concluded was 40% of those measures pay for themselves today. We should do them immediately. But if you're thinking about it from the customer's perspective, who's a customer? A building owner. Well, what's their challenge? It's all over the map, right? Well, what if as a customer they had a service that allowed them to do everything at once? What would that look like? It's a negative net cost. So instead of saying, let's just cherry pick the easy stuff and leave the hard stuff for later because we don't know how to do it, why don't we do everything at once and finance it? One of the reasons we don't do that is because our business models for delivering these services provide customers with almost no information. How are they possibly going to value service when they don't have information? Contrast that to a hybrid vehicle which has 14 different data points of information. We're going to start labeling buildings for energy performance. Seattle has already moved towards that becoming a reality in a voluntary program, and I can tell you within this decade it'll be pretty much mandatory everywhere because people will value that information. It turns out if you give people in the marketplace information, they act upon it. This is energy. Think about water. How much information do you as a homeowner get about water consumption? None. Considering it's the most valuable resource on the planet, potable water, how is it possible that our business model provides no information to the end user about their consumption of water and its value? None. Well, that day is going to change as well. Local government has a key role in making this happen. And I would say there are three things that are important about the work that we need to do. One is a deep and sustained engagement about what we need to do and can do, long-term, value-based conversation. It's not about, gee, we can give you a better incentive for a new appliance, or we'll give you a free rain barrel. It's, what is our reality going to be 30 years from now? What's it going to take to get there? So then the public may support the sort of business models, policies, and institutional changes necessary to make it operational. And the third is organize capital around these ideas. Think about scale in a different way. No one could solve the city's problem in one move. You look at a neighborhood and you can start to get your mind around solving a problem. You pick a neighborhood that has an appetite for innovation and you invest in that. And you identify the right scale for investing in a system. And you mobilize and organize capital around that system. And in that neighborhood, they've achieved a 70% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions at a 7.5% return on investment. So it can be done. if we think about business models in this way. So there are more slides to this, and you'll be welcome to those, and I'd be happy to talk more about this. But I wanted to give you a flavor of what I think is emerging as a way to think about the business models and to cities that are critical for our continued functioning in cities. So thanks very much.